I thought my family was grieving my father's death. That's what I believed while we stood beside Harold Anderson's grave under the cold Ohio rain. But 3 nights later, I climbed into my father's attic searching for an old photo of my mother and found a sealed envelope hidden behind a box of Christmas decorations. My hands started shaking before I even opened it. Because written across the front in my father's uneven handwriting were 7 words that changed everything. For Betty, only if they betray you. And in that moment, I realized the tears at my father's funeral may have been nothing more than a performance. If you've ever felt betrayed by the people you trusted most, I'd love to hear your story in the comments. And before we continue, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there tonight. These late-night conversations mean more to me than you know. If stories like this touch your heart, don't forget to like and subscribe so we can keep sharing them together. I grew up believing my father could fix almost anything. Broken chairs, leaking pipes, cracked windows, even broken hearts. Harold Anderson owned a small woodworking shop just outside Dayton, Ohio for more than 40 years. People in town respected him because he worked hard, kept his word, and never asked anyone for help. His hands were rough from decades of carving oak and maple, and when I was little, I used to hold those giant hands while walking through the county fair like nothing in the world could hurt me. But life has a cruel way of shrinking even the strongest people, especially after loss. My mother Eleanor died 12 years before my father did. Breast cancer. Slow, painful. By the end, she barely weighed enough to hold herself upright. I still remember the night she reached for my hand in the hospital and whispered, "Take care of your father when I'm gone. He doesn't know how to be alone." I promised her I would, and I kept that promise. At 62 years old, I was still driving across town 3 or 4 times a week to check on him. I brought groceries, cooked soup, sorted medications, drove him to doctor appointments, cleaned the gutters when his knees got too weak. I even learned how to reset the old furnace because my father refused to replace it. "Still got some life left in her," he'd say with a grin. Truthfully, I didn't mind helping him. Not really. After my divorce 15 years earlier, my life had become painfully quiet. I worked part-time at the local library, lived alone in a small townhouse, and spent most evenings reading or watching old television reruns with my cat curled beside me. Taking care of my father gave me purpose. It gave me someone to love. My younger brother Michael saw things differently. To him, our father was an inconvenience. Michael was 56 and always chasing some new business opportunity that never quite worked out. One year it was real estate. The next year it was cryptocurrency. Then restaurants. Then online investments. He drove expensive cars he couldn't afford and wore polished suits while drowning in debt nobody else could see. Whenever he visited Dad, the conversation somehow turned toward money. Always money. "Dad, you should sell this place while the market's hot. Dad, you don't need this giant house anymore. Dad, you know property taxes are killing you, right?" My father would just stare at him quietly until Michael changed the subject. Susan was different, more subtle. My younger sister had mastered the art of sounding caring while saying cruel things. "Oh, Betty, you really shouldn't exhaust yourself like this. Oh, Betty, Dad needs professional help now. Oh, Betty, you've become obsessed with this house." But Susan rarely visited unless holidays were involved, or paperwork, or inheritance conversations disguised as concern. Her husband Daniel hardly spoke at all. He followed Susan everywhere like a silent shadow nodding along while she smiled with perfect white teeth and pretended to care about family unity. Still, I tried to believe we were a family. Even fractured families carry hope. At least that's what I told myself. One November evening, about 3 months before my father died, I arrived at his house carrying chicken noodle soup and fresh bread from the bakery downtown. The television was on but muted. Dad sat alone in his recliner, staring at nothing. The room felt strange. Heavy. "You okay?" I asked. He blinked like I'd interrupted a bad dream. "Oh. Hey, sweetheart." His voice sounded tired. Older than usual. I set the soup down and noticed unopened mail stacked beside him. That wasn't like him. My father paid every bill the day it arrived. I started sorting through the envelopes while he watched me silently. Then he suddenly asked, "Did Michael call you recently?" I looked up. No. Why, Dad rubbed his jaw nervously. "No reason." That answer stayed with me, because my father hated lying, and that was a lie. Over the next few weeks, little things began bothering me. Michael started visiting more often. Susan called Dad constantly. Whenever I entered the room during one of their visits, conversations stopped immediately. Once I walked into the kitchen and found Michael standing beside Dad holding a folder full of papers. Michael closed it so quickly you would have thought I caught him stealing. "Just helping Dad organize documents," he said casually. But my father looked embarrassed, almost ashamed. Another time I overheard Susan arguing with him in the garage. "You can't keep favoring Betty forever," she snapped. Then silence. When I stepped inside, Susan instantly smiled. "Oh, we were just talking about Christmas." I knew she was lying too, but I said nothing. That's what families do sometimes. We ignore what scares us because the truth feels too painful to face. A week before Christmas, snow covered the streets outside Dad's house. I stayed late that evening helping him decorate the tree because arthritis had made climbing ladders impossible for him. We sat together afterward drinking coffee in the glow of colored lights. He looked so tired. Not physically, emotionally, like something inside him had been wearing down for years. Then suddenly he said my name very softly. "Betty." I turned toward him. "There's something I need to tell you." My stomach tightened instantly. He stared toward the hallway as if checking whether someone was listening. Then he leaned closer. "If anything happens to me," before he could finish, headlights swept across the living room window. Michael's truck. Dad immediately went quiet. The fear on his face startled me. Actually, fear. Not irritation, not frustration. Fear. Michael walked through the front door without knocking. "Hey, everybody," he said too loudly. Dad leaned back in his recliner and forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Whatever he wanted to tell me died in that moment. And somehow, I knew he wouldn't try again. A few days later, I found him alone in the workshop behind the house. The old woodworking tools hung untouched on the walls. Dust covered the workbench. He wasn't building anymore. He just sat there staring at an unfinished rocking chair. "Mom's chair?" I asked softly. He nodded. "She always wanted one." My chest hurt looking at him. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small brass key. "This opens the attic," he said quietly. I frowned. "The attic's been locked for years." "I know." He placed the key into my hand and closed my fingers around it. "If you ever need to understand certain things, you go up there." I stared at him confused. "What things?" He opened his mouth to answer, but once again headlights appeared outside. Susan's car this time. And just like before, my father's entire expression changed. The walls went back up instantly. "Never mind," he muttered. That night, while driving home through falling snow, I couldn't stop thinking about the look in his eyes. Not fear for himself, fear for me. At the time, I told myself I was imagining things. I wish I had trusted my instincts sooner, because less than 3 months later, my father would be dead, and everything I thought I knew about my family would begin to unravel. My father died on a gray Tuesday morning in March. I was shelving books at the library when my phone started ringing inside my cardigan pocket. I almost ignored it because the library had a strict no-phone policy during shifts, but something inside me tightened the moment I saw Michael's name on the screen. My brother never called unless something was wrong. The second I answered, I heard forced panic in his voice. "Betty, it's Dad!" The world around me went silent. "What happened?" "He collapsed this morning. The paramedics came, but..." He paused dramatically. "He's gone. Gone." Such a small word for something that destroys an entire life. I don't remember leaving work. I don't remember driving. I only remember gripping the steering wheel so hard my fingers cramped while snow mixed with cold rain against the windshield. By the time I reached my father's house, the ambulance was already gone. A coroner's van sat in the driveway. Susan stood near the porch wearing a long beige coat, dabbing dry eyes with a tissue. But the moment she saw me, something about her expression changed too quickly, like she had to remember to look sad. I pushed past her and entered the house. Everything smelled faintly of coffee. Dad's mug still sat on the kitchen counter. Half full, still warm. That detail broke me more than anything else, because it meant his morning had started normally. He probably woke up, made coffee, maybe looked out the window like he always did. Maybe he planned to call me later. Maybe he thought he had more time. I sank into one of the kitchen chairs and cried so hard I could barely breathe. Michael came in a few minutes later and placed a hand awkwardly on my shoulder. We did everything we could. Something about the sentence irritated me immediately. We. Not I. Not the paramedics. We. As though he had already positioned himself at the center of everything. I wiped my face and asked quietly, "Who found him?" Michael glanced toward the hallway. "I did." "You were here?" "Yeah. I stopped by this morning." That surprised me. Michael rarely visited before noon, especially on weekdays. Before I could ask more questions, Susan entered carrying Dad's medication box. "We should probably gather all his important documents soon," she said softly. I stared at her. Our father's body had barely left the house, and she was already talking about paperwork. At first, I tried convincing myself grief affects people differently. Some people cry, some people become practical, some people emotionally shut down. That's what I told myself. But over the next few days, little moments kept eating at me. The funeral home meeting was the first. I sat frozen while discussing caskets and flower arrangements, unable to focus because my father's death still didn't feel real. Meanwhile, Michael kept checking his phone. Susan repeatedly asked about estate costs. Daniel quietly took notes. At one point, the funeral director asked whether Dad had prepaid burial arrangements. Before I could answer, Michael quickly said, "Dad's finances are under control." Again, that strange sense of ownership. Control. Authority. As though he had stepped into a role nobody gave him. The night before the funeral, I stayed alone at Dad's house organizing old photographs for the memorial slideshow. I found pictures from camping trips, Christmas mornings, my parents dancing barefoot in the kitchen when they thought nobody was watching. There was one photo of me at 8 years old sitting inside Dad's workshop, covered in sawdust while he carved a wooden bird. I held that picture against my chest and cried until my eyes burned. That house carried an entire lifetime inside its walls. Every scratch on the hardwood floor, every faded wallpaper corner, every creak in the staircase, and suddenly I couldn't shake the horrible feeling that everyone else saw it differently, not as a home, as an asset. The funeral took place on Friday beneath dark clouds and bitter wind. Nearly the entire town came. Former customers from Dad's shop, old church friends, neighbors. People who hadn't seen him in years still showed up because Harold Anderson had once helped them build a porch or repair a table or quietly pay for something when times were hard. That was who my father was. A good man. A generous man, which made what happened afterward feel even uglier. At the cemetery, Susan cried loudly whenever someone approached her. Too loudly, but the second people walked away, her tears vanished almost instantly. Michael gave a speech about family unity that sounded rehearsed. I stood beside the grave, barely able to breathe while cold wind whipped through my coat. And then I noticed something strange. Michael and Susan kept exchanging looks. Not grieving looks. Communicating looks. Small nods. Tiny signals. Like people waiting for something important to happen. After the burial, everyone gathered in the church fellowship hall for food and coffee. I stayed mostly quiet. Exhausted. Emotionally numb. At one point, I walked toward the kitchen for fresh coffee and accidentally overheard Michael whispering to Daniel near the hallway. Need Richard to handle it fast before she starts asking questions. I stopped walking. Daniel lowered his voice. Do you think she suspects anything? Michael scoffed softly. Betty never suspects anything. A cold sensation crawled through my stomach. Before I could step closer, Susan suddenly appeared beside me carrying a tray of cookies. Oh, good, she said brightly. People are asking where the photo albums are. Her timing felt too perfect. That night after everyone left, I stayed behind to help clean the church hall. Michael stood near the exit, talking quietly with attorney Richard Coleman, Dad's longtime lawyer. I'd known Richard since childhood. He handled Will's property taxes and legal paperwork for half the town. Usually he smiled warmly when he saw me, but that night he avoided eye contact completely. The second he noticed me approaching, he ended the conversation with Michael abruptly. We'll discuss everything Monday, he muttered. Then he hurried away. I watched him leave with a strange knot forming in my chest. When I turned back around, Michael forced a smile. Richard's going to read Dad's will next week. I blinked. Already? Well, there's a lot to handle. There it was again. Handle. Organize. Control. Everything sounded rushed. Too rushed. Susan joined us moments later, looping her arm through mine. You know Dad loved all of us equally, she said softly. The statement felt oddly specific, almost prepared. I pulled my arm away gently. Why would you say that? Her smile flickered for half a second. No reason. But there was a reason. I just didn't understand it yet. The next morning, I returned to Dad's house alone to water the plants and feed his old golden retriever, Murphy. The silence inside the house crushed me. His glasses still rested beside the newspaper. His coat still hung near the door. A pair of unfinished crossword puzzles sat beside his recliner. It felt impossible that someone could simply disappear from their own life overnight. While filling Murphy's bowl in the kitchen, I noticed something odd through the dining room doorway. Dad's filing cabinet was slightly open. I frowned. Dad never left it open. Ever. I walked closer. Folders were out of place. Some papers looked disturbed, as if someone had searched through them quickly. Then I noticed muddy footprints near the back door. Fresh ones. My pulse quickened. Someone had been inside the house after the funeral. Someone looking for something. And deep down, before I had proof of anything at all, I already knew who. The reading of my father's will took place 4 days later. I barely slept the night before. Something deep inside me felt wrong. Not grief. Not exactly. It was the feeling you get before a thunderstorm arrives. That strange pressure in the air when your instincts start whispering warnings your mind isn't ready to hear. Richard Coleman's office sat above an old insurance agency downtown. I had climbed those narrow stairs dozens of times over the years with my father. Richard handled property taxes, insurance disputes, and legal documents for our family since I was young. Back then, the office felt comforting, safe. But that morning, it felt cold, hostile. Michael arrived first wearing an expensive charcoal suit and a dark blue tie that probably cost more than my monthly grocery bill. Susan came 10 minutes later carrying a leather handbag and oversized sunglasses despite the cloudy weather. Daniel followed behind her silently. Nobody hugged me. Nobody asked how I was holding up. Michael simply checked his watch and muttered Richard should be ready soon. Ready. As if this were a business meeting instead of the dismantling of our father's life. Richard finally opened the office door and motioned us inside. His smile looked strained. Please sit. I noticed folders already organized neatly across the conference table. One stack sat directly in front of Michael. Another smaller one rested near Susan. Only a single thin envelope sat at my chair. Something about that detail made my stomach tighten immediately. Richard cleared his throat. As you know, Harold Anderson updated his estate documents approximately 8 months ago. I blinked. Updated Dad never mentioned changing anything. Richard continued reading in a dull, professional voice, while rain tapped softly against the windows. At the time of his passing, Mr. Anderson's primary residence and majority financial holdings are to transfer to his son, Michael Anderson. I stopped breathing for a second. Richard continued. A secondary financial distribution and investment portfolio are designated to Susan Carter. Susan lowered her eyes dramatically, pretending emotion. Michael leaned back quietly in his chair, but I caught it. That tiny, satisfied exhale. Then Richard looked toward me. To Betty Anderson. Harold Anderson leaves a personal keepsake box containing family memorabilia and sentimental items of emotional significance. Silence. Complete silence. I stared at him, waiting for the rest. There had to be more. There simply had to be. But Richard slowly closed the folder. That concludes the primary distribution. The room tilted. I could actually hear my heartbeat inside my ears. For 12 years I had cared for my father nearly every day. I drove him to appointments, paid bills when he forgot, cooked meals, sat beside his hospital bed after surgeries, held his hand through nights he couldn't sleep after Mom died, and somehow I was left with a box. A box. Susan reached across the table and touched my arm gently. "Oh, Betty," she whispered. "Dad knew how much you treasured memories." I pulled my arm away instantly. The words felt rehearsed, prepared. Michael sighed dramatically. "I know this is hard, but Dad made his choices." I looked directly at him. "Did you know about this?" His expression hardened for half a second before softening again. "He talked to me some about estate planning, sure. Some. Not all." Again, careful wording. I turned toward Richard. "My father never told me he changed his will." Richard adjusted his glasses nervously. "Well, clients aren't obligated to discuss those matters." His voice lacked confidence. And for the first time in my life, I saw something I never expected to see in Richard Coleman. Guilt. 1,000 memories started crashing through my mind at once. Dad falling asleep in his recliner while waiting for me to bring dinner. Dad apologizing for needing help climbing stairs. Dad pressing that brass attic key into my hand. If anything happens to me... My chest tightened painfully. This didn't make sense. It didn't fit the man I knew. Michael suddenly stood. Well, we should probably begin discussing the house. The house. Not our father, not grief, not loss. The house. I stared at him in disbelief. Our father died less than 2 weeks ago. Michael rubbed his forehead impatiently. And we still have responsibilities, Betty. Susan nodded sadly. Maintaining that property is expensive. I looked around the room slowly. That was the exact moment something inside me changed. Not snapped, not exploded, changed. Because for the first time, I stopped seeing my siblings as grieving family members making poor decisions under emotional stress. I saw opportunists, predators circling an estate before the body was even cold. Richard slid the thin envelope toward me carefully. Your father requested you receive this personally. My fingers trembled as I opened it. Inside was a small inventory list describing the keepsake box stored at the house. Old photographs, family letters, military medals belonging to my grandfather, Mom's recipe book. That was all. No explanation, no personal note. Nothing. A strange numbness spread through me. I wanted to scream, cry, demand answers. Instead, I quietly folded the paper and placed it back into the envelope. Because somewhere deep inside me, I suddenly remembered my father's face the night he gave me the attic key. Fear. Real fear. And fear like that doesn't come from nowhere. Michael began discussing real estate values with Richard while I sat frozen. The market's strong right now, he said. We should probably list the property within the month. Within the month. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. That house belonged to Mom and Dad for 43 years, I whispered. Michael looked irritated. And, such a cruel word, as if memories had no value at all. Susan leaned forward sympathetically. You know Dad wouldn't want us fighting. The hypocrisy nearly made me laugh. Fight I hadn't even spoken yet, but somehow they already sounded defensive, like people protecting something fragile or stolen. Richard finally ended the meeting after another 20 minutes of financial discussions that made me feel sick. Michael and Susan left together. Daniel followed, carrying several folders under his arm. Before exiting, Michael stopped beside me. You should try not to take this personally. I looked up slowly. How exactly should I take it? He hesitated, then shrugged. Dad saw things differently near the end. Near the end. Another phrase that bothered me, because my father had remained mentally sharp until the day he died. He balanced his own accounts, read history books, argued politics with television anchors, corrected my grammar constantly. So why did everyone suddenly talk about him like a confused old man? I waited until they left before turning toward Richard. The office felt painfully quiet. Finally, I asked the question burning inside me. Did my father really do this willingly? Richard's face tightened instantly. And there it was again. That guilt. That hesitation. But after several seconds, he simply answered. The documents were legally signed. Legally. Not honestly. Not fairly. Legally. I stood slowly and picked up my coat. Can I collect the keepsake box today? Richard nodded. It's still at the house. As I reached the door, he suddenly spoke again. Betty. I turned. For one brief moment, he looked like he wanted to say something important, something human. But then fear crossed his face, and whatever truth sat behind his eyes disappeared. "Take care of yourself," he muttered. Outside, rain poured across the sidewalks. I sat inside my car, gripping the steering wheel while tears blurred my vision. I felt humiliated, discarded, stupid. Maybe Susan was right. Maybe I had built my entire life around taking care of someone who never intended to choose me in return. Maybe love really could be that one-sided. But then, through all the grief and confusion, one memory suddenly pushed itself forward, stronger than the others. My father placing that brass key into my hand. "If you ever need to understand certain things, you go up there." I stopped crying instantly. The attic. My pulse quickened, because suddenly, for the first time since the funeral, I realized my father may have known this day was coming. I waited until evening before returning to my father's house. Part of me felt ridiculous, like I was chasing ghosts because I couldn't accept the truth. But another part of me, the quieter, older part shaped by years of watching people carefully, knew something was terribly wrong. The sky above Dayton had turned dark blue by the time I pulled into the driveway. Rainwater still dripped from the gutters, and the porch light cast long shadows across the yard my father used to mow every Saturday morning without fail. Now the grass looked abandoned already. That hurt more than I expected. I unlocked the front door slowly. The house greeted me with silence. Not peaceful silence. Empty silence. The kind that reminds you someone important is never coming back. Murphy lifted his head from beside the fireplace and walked toward me with slow, tired steps. When I knelt to pet him, he rested his head against my chest and sighed heavily. "You miss him too, huh?" I whispered. The dog's sadness nearly broke me again. I carried the keepsake box into the kitchen and placed it on the table beneath the yellow overhead light. For several minutes, I just stared at it. This was all my father supposedly left me. A cardboard box filled with memories, as if my entire relationship with him could be packed away and handed over like unwanted attic clutter. Finally, I opened it. The smell of old paper and cedar drifted upward instantly. Inside were dozens of photographs. My mother standing beside Dad outside the woodworking shop in 1974. Susan at 16 wearing a cheerleading uniform. Michael holding a fish almost bigger than his body. One picture stopped me cold. It showed me sitting beside my father at the hospital while Mom slept in the background during chemotherapy treatments. Dad's arm rested around my shoulders. We both looked exhausted, but close. Very close. Tears blurred my vision again. Why would a man who trusted me with his grief leave me with nothing? I kept sorting through the box carefully. There were birthday cards, old report cards, letters Mom wrote to Dad before they married, and then buried beneath a stack of photographs, I found something strange. A tiny brass key. My breath caught immediately. The attic key. I turned it over slowly in my hand. I had completely forgotten about it after the funeral chaos. But now memories flooded back all at once. "If you ever need to understand certain things, you go up there." I looked toward the hallway ceiling instinctively. The attic. For years, Dad kept it locked. Even when roof repairs were needed, he insisted on going up himself despite his bad knees. At the time, I thought maybe the attic just reminded him too much of Mom. Now I wasn't so sure. The staircase creaked beneath my feet as I walked upstairs. The hallway smelled faintly of dust and old wood polish. Everything remained exactly as Dad left it. His bedroom slippers still beside the bed. Reading glasses on the nightstand. A half-finished crossword puzzle near the lamp. The sight hollowed me out inside. I reached the narrow attic door near the linen closet and stood there silently for several seconds. Then I slid the brass key into the lock. Click! The sound echoed unnaturally loud. A cold chill moved down my spine. I pulled the string hanging from the ceiling hatch, and the folding ladder unfolded slowly with a heavy groan. Dust drifted through the air. For a moment, I almost turned back. Because suddenly, this didn't feel like curiosity anymore. It felt like stepping into something my father intentionally hid, something important. I climbed carefully into the attic, holding a flashlight from the hallway closet. The beam cut through darkness and floating dust particles. The attic smelled like cedarwood insulation and old winters. Boxes lined the walls, Christmas decorations, old clothes, broken lamps. My mother's sewing machine sat beneath a white sheet in the corner. I moved deeper inside, slowly shining the flashlight across decades of forgotten family history. At first, nothing seemed unusual, just storage, just memories. Then I noticed something odd near the far wall. One of the large Christmas storage bins had been moved recently. Dust patterns on the floor showed clear drag marks. My pulse quickened. Someone else had been up here. Recently. I crouched beside the bin and pushed it aside carefully. Behind it sat a small metal lockbox. My hands started trembling instantly, because taped to the top was an envelope, and written across the front in my father's unmistakable handwriting were the exact words from my memory for Betty. Only if they betray you. I stopped breathing. The attic suddenly felt freezing cold. Every instinct inside me screamed that whatever sat inside that envelope would change everything. For several seconds, I couldn't move. I just stared at my name written in my father's shaky handwriting. He knew. Somehow before he died, he knew. My fingers shook violently as I peeled the envelope open. Inside were several folded documents and a handwritten letter. I unfolded the first document carefully. The moment I saw the title at the top of the page, my entire body went numb. Last Will and Testament of Harold J. Anderson. I stared at the pages in disbelief. This wasn't the same will Richard Coleman read in his office. Not even close. I flipped through the pages rapidly. My father's house was left to me. The majority of his savings were left to me. Control over family assets and property decisions all left to me. Michael and Susan each received smaller financial distributions with strict limitations attached. My vision blurred. Oh my God. The words barely escaped my mouth. The will contained notarization stamps, witness signatures, dates. Everything appeared official, real. Which meant only one thing. The document Richard read was fake. A horrifying dizziness swept over me. I grabbed an old wooden chair nearby to steady myself. My own brother and sister. No, I couldn't think it yet. Couldn't fully let myself believe it. Not until I read the letter. I unfolded the handwritten pages carefully. The first line shattered whatever denial remained inside me. Betty, if you are reading this, then I was right to be afraid. Tears instantly filled my eyes. I pressed my hand against my mouth while reading further. Your brother and sister have pressured me for months about changing my will. Michael's financial situation is far worse than he admits. Susan believes this house is worth more to her than the memories inside it. I tried to keep peace in the family, but I realized too late that peace built on dishonesty eventually becomes poison. My chest tightened painfully. Your father continued writing. You were the only one who stayed after your mother died. The only one who helped me without asking for anything in return. I needed to protect you from what I feared they might do after I was gone. I love all my children, but love does not excuse greed. By then I was crying openly, not quiet tears, the kind of crying that comes from betrayal so deep it changes the shape of your heart. Then I reached the final paragraph. If Richard fails to honor my real wishes, trust no one until you find proper legal help. And Betty, do not let them make you believe you were unloved. Never that. Dad. I lowered the letter slowly into my lap. The attic was completely silent except for my uneven breathing. Everything suddenly made sense. Michael's urgency, Susan's fake sympathy, Richard's guilt, the disturbed filing cabinet, the rushed will reading, they already knew. And worst of all, my father spent his final months terrified of his own children. A sound downstairs suddenly echoed through the house, a door closing. My entire body froze. I wasn't alone. The sound downstairs came again, heavy footsteps. Slow, careful. My heart slammed against my ribs so hard I thought whoever entered the house might hear it through the ceiling. For one terrifying second, I imagined Michael climbing the attic ladder and finding me holding the real will in my shaking hands. Instinct took over. I shoved the documents back into the envelope, grabbed the metal lockbox, and pulled the Christmas bin back into place as quickly as I could. Another sound echoed below. Kitchen cabinets opening. Whoever was downstairs wasn't just stopping by. They were searching. I crouched silently in the darkness, barely breathing. Then Murphy barked once downstairs. A man's voice answered softly. Daniel. I recognized it immediately. My blood turned cold. Why was Susan's husband inside the house alone at night? I moved carefully toward the attic opening and lowered myself just enough to see through the crack near the ladder. Daniel stood in the hallway below, holding a flashlight, not turning lights on, not acting like family, acting like someone who didn't want to be noticed. He walked directly toward Dad's office. My stomach twisted violently. He knew exactly where he was going. For the next several minutes, I listened to drawers opening and papers shifting. Then came something even worse. His phone rang. Daniel answered in a whisper. No. She's not here. A pause. Then I already checked the filing cabinet. Another pause. She must not have found it. I felt physically sick. Michael and Susan knew something else existed. They were hunting for it, and if I had come an hour later, the real will might have disappeared forever. Daniel finally left 20 minutes later. I stayed frozen in the attic until I heard his car pull away from the driveway. Only then did I allow myself to breathe properly again. My legs nearly collapsed beneath me as I climbed downstairs. The office looked disturbed again. Desk drawers half open, cabinet folders shifted. A lamp knocked crooked. I stood there staring at the mess while one horrible realization settled deep into my chest. This wasn't grief anymore. This was war. I locked every door in the house before sitting at the kitchen table with the envelope and letter spread out beneath the overhead light. Outside, rain tapped against the windows. Inside, my entire life was unraveling. I reread Dad's letter 3 times. Every sentence hurt more than the last. Your brother and sister have pressured me for months. I thought back carefully. The strange tension. The secret conversations, Michael visiting constantly near the end, Susan suddenly acting concerned about Dad's mental decline. At the time, I thought they were simply becoming more involved as Dad aged. Now I understood. They weren't helping him. They were positioning themselves. My eyes drifted toward the signature at the bottom of the real will. Harold J. Anderson. Strong, steady. Nothing like the shaky signature on the document Richard Coleman read in his office. I suddenly remembered something else. During the will reading, Michael kept insisting Dad saw things differently near the end. Not grieving words, defensive words, prepared words, as though he expected questions before they were even asked. I pressed my hands against my face. How long had this been happening? How long had my father been trapped inside this pressure while pretending everything was fine? The thought devastated me, because I should have noticed. I should have protected him. But instead, I kept convincing myself our family still had goodness left inside it. I barely slept that night. Every sound outside made me jump. At dawn, I hid the real will, the letter, and the lockbox inside a canvas bag beneath blankets in my car trunk. Then I drove straight to the only person I trusted enough not to panic. My friend Carol. We'd known each other since high school. Carol lived alone in a brick ranch house outside town and possessed the kind of practical wisdom that comes from surviving difficult things quietly. The second she opened the front door and saw my face, she said, "What happened?" I burst into tears. An hour later, we sat at her kitchen table drinking coffee while I explained everything. Carol read the letter silently. Then she looked up slowly. "You understand, this means the other will is fraudulent, right?" Hearing someone else say it out loud made everything terrifyingly real. "I know. You also understand this could become criminal." My throat tightened. "They're my family." Carol's expression softened sadly. "Betty, people steal from strangers every day. Family just knows where to aim the knife." I looked away because the truth hurt too much. Carol tapped the papers carefully. "You need a lawyer immediately." "Not Richard." I nodded slowly. "There's a probate attorney in Cincinnati my cousin used after her husband died," Carol said. "Emily Parker." The name meant nothing to me then, but it would soon change everything. By noon, I sat inside a modern downtown law office nearly 90 minutes away from home. Emily Parker looked younger than I expected. Early 40s maybe. Sharp gray blazer, calm eyes that noticed everything. She listened without interrupting while I explained the entire situation from beginning to end. When I finally handed her the two wills side by side, her entire demeanor changed. She adjusted her glasses carefully and examined the signatures for nearly 5 straight minutes. Then she asked quietly, "Did your father have any diagnosis involving dementia or cognitive decline?" "Number medication affecting judgment." "He had arthritis medication, blood pressure medication." "Nothing severe." Emily nodded slowly. Then she pointed toward the fake will. This signature was traced. My pulse stopped. "What?" She turned both pages toward me. "See these hesitation marks? The pressure inconsistencies. Someone copied his signature slowly instead of writing naturally." I stared at the page in horror. Emily continued calmly. "This doesn't prove who forged it yet, but it strongly suggests fraud." Fraud. The word echoed through me like broken glass. My own brother. My own sister. I suddenly remembered Christmas dinners, birthday parties, family vacations, all those years pretending we loved each other while greed quietly grew underneath everything. Emily folded her hands together. "There's another issue." I looked up nervously. "The attorney." "Richard. If he knowingly submitted a fraudulent will, this becomes extremely serious." I swallowed hard. But what if he didn't know? Emily gave me a long look. Then someone manipulated him too. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Finally, Emily leaned forward slightly. "Betty? I need you to answer honestly. Are you emotionally prepared for what comes next?" I frowned. "What do you mean?" She paused carefully before answering. "Contesting this will could destroy what remains of your family relationships permanently." I almost laughed, because sitting there in that office, I realized something heartbreaking. Those relationships were already gone. Maybe they had been gone for years. I just hadn't wanted to see it. I looked down at Dad's letter again. "Do not let them make you believe you were unloved." Tears burned my eyes instantly. "No," I whispered softly. "I'm not ready." Emily nodded sympathetically. "Most people aren't." Then her expression hardened professionally. "But your father trusted you to finish this." Outside the office window, snow began falling softly over the city, and for the first time since my father died, I stopped feeling helpless. Not safe, not healed, but no longer helpless, because now I knew the truth. And somewhere beneath all the grief and betrayal growing inside me, something else had started growing too. Resolve. The next 2 weeks changed me in ways I still struggle to explain. Grief alone changes a person, but grief mixed with betrayal becomes something else entirely. It sharpens you. Every conversation suddenly carries hidden meanings. Every smile looks suspicious. Every memory becomes evidence. Emily Parker moved quickly, much faster than I expected. Within 48 hours, she filed an emergency petition preventing Michael and Susan from selling or transferring any estate assets until the validity of the will could be investigated. Michael called me less than an hour after receiving notice. I stared at my phone while it rang. Part of me still wanted to believe there had been some misunderstanding, some terrible explanation that would magically restore my family, but deep down I already knew. I answered anyway. "What the hell are you doing?" Michael snapped immediately. "No greeting, no concern, just anger. I could ask you the same thing." Silence. Then his tone softened artificially. "Betty, listen to me. You're upset right now. Grief makes people irrational." I nearly laughed. That same word again. Irrational. It sounded rehearsed now, like he'd been preparing to discredit me for months. "I found Dad's real will," I said quietly. The silence on the other end became absolute. Not confusion, not shock. Fear. Then Michael exhaled slowly. "You shouldn't have gone through his private things." Private things. Not, "What are you talking about?" Not, "There must be some mistake." His reaction told me everything. "I know about the attic," I whispered. Another long silence followed. Finally, he spoke again, colder this time. "You have no idea what Dad was really like near the end." My grip tightened around the phone. What does that mean? He changed his mind constantly. One day he loved you, next day he blamed you for controlling him. The cruelty of the lie stunned me. My father never once accused me of controlling him. Not once. And Michael knew it. "You're lying!" Michael's voice hardened instantly. "You want to drag this family through court over money. Fine. But don't pretend you're doing it for Dad." Then he hung up. I sat frozen at my kitchen table staring at the silent phone while rage slowly replaced heartbreak. Because for the first time in my life, I realized my brother didn't just resent me. He despised me. Emily later told me Michael immediately hired one of the most aggressive probate litigation attorneys in Columbus. That alone raised questions, because legal battles like this are expensive. Very expensive. And according to Dad's letter, Michael was already drowning financially. So where was the money coming from Emily intended to find out? The investigation began quietly, carefully, methodically. Emily hired a forensic handwriting specialist who confirmed strong indications of signature tracing on the fake will. Meanwhile, subpoenas were sent requesting banking records, communication logs, and notarization documentation. That's when things started getting ugly, very ugly. The notary's signature attached to the fraudulent will belonged to a man named Walter Green, 73 years old, semi-retired, lived outside Cincinnati. Emily and I drove to meet him on a cold Thursday afternoon. The second Walter opened his door and saw legal folders in Emily's hands, his face drained of color. "We just have a few questions," Emily said calmly. He invited us inside reluctantly. The man looked terrified before we even sat down. Emily placed both wills on the kitchen table. "Did you witness Harold Anderson signing this document?" Walter adjusted his glasses nervously. "Yes. I think so." "You think so?" He swallowed hard. "It was months ago." Emily leaned forward slightly. Mr. Green Harold Anderson's medical records show severe arthritis in his dominant hand during this period, yet this signature shows almost no tremor patterns. Walter's hands began shaking. I watched panic spread across his face slowly. Then Emily asked the question directly. "Were you physically present when this will was signed?" Walter broke. Not dramatically, quietly, like an exhausted man carrying something too heavy for too long. "No," he whispered. The word hit me like a gunshot. My chest tightened instantly. Walter rubbed his face shakily. "Richard Coleman told me the paperwork was already signed properly. He just needed expedited notarization for estate processing." I stared at him in disbelief. "You notarized a will without witnessing the signature?" Tears filled the old man's eyes immediately. "I know what I did was wrong." Emily stayed calm. "Did Richard know the signature was forged?" Walter looked down. "I don't know," but his hesitation said otherwise. Outside Walter's house afterwards, snow crunched beneath our shoes while I struggled to process what we'd just heard. Emily finally spoke quietly. "This is bigger than inheritance fraud now." I wrapped my coat tighter around myself. "Do you think Richard helped them?" Emily paused carefully. "I think Richard knows more than he admits." That night, I couldn't sleep again. I sat in my living room replaying every interaction with Richard Coleman throughout my life. Birthday parties, holiday dinners. Dad trusted him completely. So how does a man betray a friend of 40 years, money, fear, pressure? I didn't know anymore, but the next discovery destroyed whatever remained of my innocence. 3 days later, Emily called me early in the morning. "Betty, I need you to come to my office." Her tone alone made my stomach drop. When I arrived, several documents already sat spread across the conference table. Emily pointed toward one bank statement. Michael withdrew nearly $80,000 from a business line of credit 6 weeks before your father died. I frowned. "So, he transferred almost all of it into payments toward overdue debt accounts." My pulse quickened. How bad are his finances? Emily slid another folder toward me. Wage garnishment notices, defaulted loans, tax liens, collection lawsuits. I stared at the paperwork in horror. Michael wasn't struggling financially. He was collapsing. He was desperate, I whispered. Emily nodded. And desperate people justify terrible things. I suddenly remembered overhearing Susan months earlier. "Dad owes us." At the time, I thought she sounded spoiled. Now I understood. They truly believed Dad's money belonged to them already, and my presence threatened that. Then Emily showed me something worse. Security footage timestamps from a downtown bank branch. The footage showed Michael accompanying Dad into a private office 2 months before his death. Dad looked weak, unsteady, and frightened. "Can you zoom in?" I asked softly. Emily enlarged the still frame. My heart shattered instantly. Dad's shoulders were hunched inward, like a man walking towards something he didn't want to face. I covered my mouth with trembling fingers. He looked scared. Emily nodded quietly. "There's more." She handed me appointment records from Dad's physician. The day Michael brought him to the bank, Dad had been prescribed strong pain medication after a severe arthritis flare-up, medication capable of impairing judgment. Suddenly, Dad's letter echoed inside my head again. I realized too late that peace built on dishonesty eventually becomes poison. Tears burned my eyes. My father knew they were cornering him, pressuring him, manipulating him while he was physically weak. And worst of all, he faced it mostly alone. I lowered my head into my hands. "I should have protected him." Emily's voice softened. "Petty predators hide themselves carefully inside families. That's how they survive." I looked up slowly, but he was afraid. "Yes," she said gently, "and he still found a way to leave you the truth. That nearly broke me completely, because even while terrified, even while isolated, my father still tried to save me." Before leaving the office, Emily stopped me near the elevator. "There's something else you need to prepare for." "What?" "Once Michael realizes how much evidence we've gathered, he's going to panic." I frowned. "What does that mean?" Her expression darkened slightly. "It means desperate people become unpredictable when they realize they're losing. And deep down, I knew she was right. 3 days later, Michael invited everyone to what he called a family discussion. I almost laughed when I read the text message. Family. The word felt hollow now. Emily advised me to go. "Let them talk," she said calmly over the phone. "People under pressure reveal more than they intend." So I agreed. The meeting took place at my father's house on Sunday evening, the same house Michael had already started treating like his property. When I arrived, Susan's car and Daniel's truck were already parked outside. Lights glowed warmly through the living room windows, creating the illusion of normalcy. But nothing about us was normal anymore. I sat in my car for a moment, staring at the house. Dad used to stand at that front window every morning with his coffee mug, watching birds gather near the maple tree. Now his children were circling the place like vultures. I finally stepped out and walked inside. The atmosphere hit me immediately. Tense, artificially polite. Michael stood near the fireplace holding a drink. Susan sat on the couch wearing cream-colored cashmere and carefully applied makeup that made her look softer than she really was. Daniel avoided eye contact altogether, and sitting at the dining table beside several folders was Richard Coleman. That surprised me. No, not surprised. Disappointed me. Richard looked exhausted. Older somehow. The moment our eyes met, guilt flashed across his face again. Betty Susan said brightly, "You made it." I ignored the performance and removed my coat slowly. "What's this about?" Michael gestured toward the dining room. "Let's sit." Nobody touched the coffee Susan had prepared. Nobody relaxed. This wasn't a family meeting. It was an ambush. I sat quietly while Michael opened one of the folders. "As you know, the estate situation has become Complicated. Complicated. Such a clean word for fraud. He slid several papers across the table toward me. We think it would be best if everyone agreed to settle this privately. I didn't touch the documents. Richard finally spoke softly. These papers would prevent unnecessary litigation. I looked directly at him. Unnecessary. He looked away immediately. Coward. Michael folded his hands together like a businessman negotiating a contract. You contesting Dad's will is going to destroy this family. The hypocrisy almost took my breath away. Destroy this family. They already had. I finally looked down at the documents. Release of estate claims, non-dispute agreement, financial settlement offer. They wanted me to surrender my legal challenge in exchange for money, not a large amount either. Just enough to make me disappear quietly. Susan leaned forward with fake concern. Betty? We know you're emotional right now. That word again. Emotional. I was beginning to notice a pattern. Every time I questioned them, I became unstable, confused, emotional. I looked at her calmly. You forged Dad's will? Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Susan gasped dramatically. Michael slammed a hand against the table. That's enough! But his anger came too fast, too defensive. I stayed calm, almost strangely calm. Because somewhere during the past few weeks, fear had finally burned itself out of me. All that remained now was clarity. You knew about the attic, I said quietly. The room froze instantly. Susan's face lost color. Michael stared at me without blinking. Richard closed his eyes briefly. There it was. Confirmation. No words necessary. Michael recovered first. You have no proof of anything. I reached into my purse slowly, then placed a folded copy of the real will directly onto the table. Silence crashed over the room. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Michael stared at the document like he'd seen a ghost. Susan's hand began trembling visibly. Richard looked physically ill. I watched every expression carefully, every reaction, because guilty people always reveal themselves before they realize they're doing it. Michael grabbed the document roughly. Where did you get this? Interesting. Not, what is this? Not that's fake. Where did you get this? I found what Dad hid. Susan suddenly stood. You had no right going through private property. I almost laughed at the absurdity. Private property, Dad left this house to me. Michael's face darkened instantly. No, he didn't. He absolutely did. He turned toward Richard desperately. Tell her that document means nothing. Richard swallowed hard. His hands visibly shook. And for a moment, I almost pitied him. Almost. Because this man sat beside my father at holiday dinners. He listened to my father talk about losing Mom. He accepted trust from our family for decades, and still allowed this to happen. Richard cleared his throat weakly. The court will determine authenticity. Emily had warned me this would happen. Delay, confusion, pressure, classic legal strategy. Susan suddenly burst into tears. Real tears this time. Not grief. Fear. You always wanted Dad to yourself, she cried. You made us feel unwanted for years. I stared at her in disbelief. That was the story she told herself. That caretaking was manipulation. That sacrifice was control. You abandoned him, I whispered. Susan flinched. Michael stood abruptly. You think you're some kind of saint because you drove him to appointments? No, I answered quietly. I think I loved him. That hit harder than yelling ever could, because deep down, they knew it was true. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then something unexpected happened. Richard suddenly looked at Michael and said quietly, "You told me Harold approved the revisions personally." Michael's head snapped toward him. "What are you doing?" Richard's voice shook now. "You said he understood everything." He did, but he never spoke during the signing meeting. The room turned ice cold. I stared at Richard carefully. This was the first crack, the first sign his conscience was finally fighting back. Michael's face twisted with fury. "You were paid to handle paperwork, Richard. Paid. Not trusted. Not respected. Paid." Richard looked devastated hearing it phrased that way, because maybe for the first time he realized he'd sold his integrity for people who didn't value him at all. Susan grabbed her husband's arm tightly. "Michael?" she whispered nervously. He ignored her completely. Then he turned toward me again. "You have no idea what Dad said about you near the end." I met his eyes steadily. "Try me." His jaw tightened. "He said you made him feel guilty all the time." The lie was so cruel and so desperate that something inside me finally stopped hurting. Because suddenly I could see him clearly, not as my little brother, not as family, just a frightened man drowning in his own greed. And frightened people attack whatever threatens exposure. I slowly reached into my purse again, then placed Dad's handwritten letter beside the will. "You should read what he actually said." Susan stared at the familiar handwriting and immediately started crying harder. Michael didn't move, didn't touch it, because he already knew what it contained. Richard finally picked up the letter with trembling hands. As he read silently, his face collapsed. Pure shame. When he reached the line, "Do not let them make you believe you were unloved." Richard lowered the paper slowly. I didn't know he whispered. I looked at him coldly. "You should have." The silence afterward felt unbearable. Even the house itself seemed heavy with grief. Murphy wandered into the room and lay beside my chair, quietly resting his head against my leg. Dad's dog. Dad's house. Dad's truth. For the first time since the funeral, I no longer felt like the outsider in that room. They did. Michael suddenly shoved his chair backward violently. "This isn't over." His voice carried panic now. Real panic. Good. Because for weeks I had been the only one afraid. Not anymore. I stood slowly and gathered the copied documents back into my purse. Then I looked around the room one final time. At Susan's smeared mascara. At Daniel's frightened silence. At Richard's collapsing guilt. And finally, at my brother. "You didn't just steal from Dad," I said quietly. "You stole the last months of peace he had left." Michael looked away first, and somehow, that hurt him more than anything else I could have said. The court hearing began 2 months later. By then, the entire family had stopped pretending. There were no more polite phone calls, no more fake concern, no more carefully rehearsed sympathy. Michael communicated only through attorneys. Susan avoided me completely in public. And Richard Coleman. Richard looked like a man slowly collapsing under the weight of his own conscience. The hearing took place inside an old probate courtroom in Dayton, with dark wooden walls and narrow stained glass windows that made the room feel more like a church than a legal building. Maybe that was fitting. Because what we were really putting on trial wasn't just a forged will. It was greed, betrayal, the death of a family. I sat beside Emily Parker at the front table wearing the navy blue dress I once wore to my mother's funeral. Not intentionally. I realized it only after catching my reflection in the courthouse restroom mirror that morning. Somehow it felt right. Because in many ways, I was burying my family all over again. Michael arrived with his attorney 15 minutes later. He looked exhausted. Not grieving exhausted. Cornered exhausted. Dark circles beneath his eyes. Jaw constantly tightening. The pressure was finally reaching him. Susan entered quietly behind him, holding Daniel's arm. She avoided looking at me. Good. I wasn't sure I could survive seeing fake tears again. Then Richard Coleman walked in. The entire courtroom shifted slightly when people noticed him, because attorneys aren't supposed to appear in hearings like this unless something has gone very wrong. Richard looked 20 years older than he had at Dad's funeral. His suit hung loosely, his shoulders slumped inward. For one brief moment, I remembered the man who used to bring peppermint candy for us as children whenever Dad dragged us into his office. That memory hurt. The judge, Eleanor Whitmore, entered promptly at 9 o'clock, sharp-eyed, calm, no patience for emotional performances. Exactly the kind of judge Emily hoped for. The proceedings began with opening statements. Michael's attorney stood first. He painted me as a lonely divorced woman, emotionally dependent on her father and unable to accept his final wishes. Listening to him describe my life like some pathetic psychological weakness made my skin crawl. Then came the worst part. Heavy caretaking relationships, the attorney argued, can sometimes create unhealthy emotional expectations. Unhealthy emotional expectations. As if loving my father was manipulation. As if devotion itself were suspicious. I felt rage rise inside me, but Emily gently touched my arm beneath the table. Stay calm. Then Emily stood, and the entire room changed. She spoke quietly, carefully. No dramatic gestures, no emotional theatrics, just facts. This case, she began, is not about sibling rivalry or disappointment over inheritance. It is about whether Harold Anderson's true wishes were intentionally concealed through fraud and coercion. Fraud. The word landed heavily. Then she introduced the real will. Dad's handwritten letter. The forensic signature analysis. The notary testimony. And slowly, piece by piece, Michael's carefully constructed version of reality began cracking apart. Walter Green testified first. The elderly notary looked terrified, walking to the witness stand. Under oath, he admitted he notarized the contested will without personally witnessing Harold Anderson sign it. Gasps moved quietly through the courtroom. Michael stared straight ahead rigidly. Susan lowered her head. Emily asked calmly, "Why did you proceed without proper verification?" Walter swallowed hard. Richard Coleman told me the signatures had already been reviewed. Every eye in the courtroom shifted toward Richard instantly. My stomach tightened painfully. Richard closed his eyes briefly. Then came the handwriting expert. She explained signature tracing patterns in detail, pointing out unnatural pauses and pressure inconsistencies in the fraudulent will. Even I could see the differences clearly now. The fake signature looked hesitant. My father's real signature always carried confidence. Strength. The expert finally stated the sentence that shattered whatever defense remained. In my professional opinion, the contested signature was not naturally executed by Harold Anderson. Susan started crying quietly beside Michael. But Michael didn't comfort her. He just stared forward with cold fury burning across his face. Then Emily introduced the financial evidence. Loan defaults, debt collections, tax liens. Michael's entire financial collapse unfolded publicly inside that courtroom. I watched humiliation spread across his face while records revealed how close he'd come to bankruptcy before Dad died. The judge studied the documents carefully. "Mr. Anderson," she asked, "were you experiencing significant financial distress during this period?" Michael's attorney immediately objected. But the damage was already done, because now motive existed, desperation existed, and everyone could see it. Then came the moment that nearly destroyed me. Emily played an audio recording recovered from Dad's old phone backup. I had never heard it before. Apparently, he accidentally recorded himself one evening while trying to use the voice memo feature. At first, the recording contained only background television noise. Then Dad's voice emerged softly, tired, fragile. "I don't know what else they want from me." My entire chest tightened instantly. A second voice entered the recording. "Michael, sharp, impatient. You owe us fairness, Dad." Dad sighed heavily. "I already helped you more than I should have. That's not enough." Silence followed. Then my father said something that broke me completely. "I'm tired, Michael. Not angry, not dramatic, just tired." The exhaustion in his voice sounded unbearable. Then came the final sentence before the recording ended. "I'm afraid this family's becoming something I don't recognize." I covered my mouth while tears streamed down my face. The courtroom had gone completely silent. Even the judge looked shaken. Because suddenly, this wasn't about money anymore. It was about an old man realizing the people he loved were pressuring him during the final months of his life. Susan began openly sobbing now. Daniel stared at the floor, and for the first time since all of this began. Michael looked uncertain, not innocent, not remorseful, just shaken by hearing Dad's fear spoken out loud. Then Emily called Richard Coleman to the stand. The room practically held its breath. Richard walked slowly to the witness chair like a man approaching execution. After being sworn in, he sat silently for several seconds before Emily asked the first question. "Mr. Coleman, did Harold Anderson ever express concern regarding pressure from his children?" Richard looked toward me briefly, then toward Michael. Finally, he whispered, "Yes." Michael's head snapped toward him instantly. Susan looked horrified. Emily continued carefully. "Did you believe Harold Anderson was vulnerable during the period in which the contested will appeared?" Richard's voice trembled. "Yes. Then why did you proceed?" That question seemed to physically crush him. Richard removed his glasses slowly. Tears filled his eyes. "Because I convinced myself it was temporary family conflict," he whispered. Michael kept saying Betty isolated him. Susan said Harold changed his mind repeatedly. I should have stopped everything until Harold spoke privately with me again. Emily's voice sharpened slightly. "But you didn't." "No." Why, Richard finally broke. "Completely. Because Michael threatened to report me for mishandling other estate matters if I delayed the paperwork." Shock rippled across the courtroom. I stared at my brother in disbelief. "Blackmail. He blackmailed our father's attorney." Michael exploded instantly. "That's a lie," but the panic in his voice destroyed whatever credibility he had left. Judge Whitmore slammed her gavel sharply. "Mr. Anderson, control yourself." Michael stood breathing heavily, and suddenly, for the first time in my life, he looked small, not powerful, not intimidating, just pathetic. A frightened man who destroyed his own family chasing money that was never truly his. Then Susan did something unexpected. She started crying harder and whispered, "I told him to stop." Everyone turned toward her. Michael stared at her in shock. Susan shook uncontrollably. "I told him Dad was getting scared." Michael's face twisted with betrayal. "You're blaming me now. You pushed too hard." The courtroom erupted into chaos. Arguments, shouting, accusations. The judge threatened contempt before finally restoring order. And sitting there in the middle of that disaster, I realized something devastating. This family had been broken long before Dad died. His death simply exposed the fracture lines everyone ignored for years. When the hearing recessed later that afternoon, Emily quietly squeezed my shoulder. "You're doing well." But I didn't feel victorious. I felt heartbroken. Because every piece of evidence proving my innocence also proved something far worse. My father spent his final months trapped inside fear created by his own children. And no courtroom ruling could ever undo that. The final hearing took place 10 days later. By then, the entire town seemed to know about the Anderson family scandal. In a place like Dayton, secrets never stay buried long, especially ugly ones. People stared when I entered grocery stores. Church friends suddenly spoke too softly around me. Some neighbors avoided eye contact altogether. Others squeezed my hand gently and whispered, "Your father was a good man." Every time I heard those words, my chest ached, because goodness was exactly what made him vulnerable. Good people spend too much time hoping others will eventually do the right thing. Sometimes they never do. The courtroom felt colder that morning, harsher. Even Michael looked different now. The arrogance was gone. In its place sat exhaustion and panic. His expensive suits no longer hid the truth underneath. He was losing everything. Susan looked worse. Her eyes were swollen from crying. Daniel barely spoke to anyone. And Richard Coleman? Richard looked like a man attending his own funeral. Emily arrived carrying several thick folders and one sealed envelope. When I asked what it was, she answered quietly, "The final piece." My stomach tightened instantly. Court began promptly at 9. Judge Whitmore wasted no time. After reviewing submitted evidence, she began "This court will now hear final testimony regarding the contested estate documents of Harold Anderson." Michael's attorney tried one last strategy. He argued Harold Anderson had been emotionally manipulated by me over many years, that caregiving created dependency, that the real will unfairly favored one child over the others. Listening to it made me physically ill, because they still refused to acknowledge the obvious truth. Love is not manipulation. Showing up is not control. Sacrifice is not selfishness. Emily stood slowly once the attorney finished. Then she walked directly toward the judge's bench holding Dad's handwritten letter. "This case," she said calmly, "has never truly been about unequal inheritance." She paused briefly. "It has been about fear." The courtroom fell silent. Emily continued. Harold Anderson feared his final wishes would be ignored. He feared pressure from financially desperate family members. And most painfully, he feared the daughter who cared for him most would eventually question whether she was loved at all. Tears instantly burned my eyes again. Emily carefully unfolded the letter. "Your Honor, with the court's permission, I would like to read Harold Anderson's final statement aloud." Permission was granted. And then, my father spoke one last time through the words he left behind. "Betty, if this letter reaches you, then I am no longer here to explain things myself. I know what this situation may make you feel. Betrayed. Forgotten. unwanted. But none of that is true. You stayed when everyone else became too busy. You sat beside your mother during treatments when even I struggled to stay strong. You carried this family quietly for years without asking for praise. Please do not confuse silence with lack of love. My throat closed completely. The courtroom disappeared around me. For a moment, it felt like Dad was sitting beside me again in that old recliner near the fireplace. Emily continued reading. Michael and Susan are not evil people, but greed changes people slowly, sometimes so slowly they no longer recognize themselves. I tried too long to keep peace by avoiding confrontation. That was my mistake. I pray someday my children forgive each other, but forgiveness cannot exist without truth. Across the courtroom, Susan lowered her face into her hands and sobbed openly. Michael stared at the floor without moving. Then Emily reached the final paragraph. Love without honesty destroys a family. Protect yourself, Betty. And remember something your mother used to say, being kind does not mean allowing people to harm you. I love you. Dad. Silence filled the courtroom after Emily finished reading. Not ordinary silence, the kind that settles over people when truth finally becomes unavoidable. Even Judge Whitmore looked emotional. Then came the final collapse. Emily called one last witness unexpectedly, a former assistant from Richard Coleman's office named Janet Mills, middle-aged, nervous, clearly terrified to testify. But once sworn in, she quietly revealed something devastating. 2 months before Harold Anderson's death, Michael repeatedly visited Richard's office demanding expedited estate changes. Janet overheard arguments, threats, and one specific sentence she never forgot. If Betty gets control of that estate, I'm finished. Michael closed his eyes instantly because he knew it was over. Janet also testified that Harold later called the office privately asking whether his original documents were still secure. When Richard assured him everything was protected, Harold responded, I hope you're right. My heart shattered hearing that. Dad knew something terrible was coming, and still nobody truly protected him. Judge Whitmore turned toward Richard Coleman directly. Mr. Coleman, do you dispute this testimony? Richard slowly stood. His hands trembled visibly. No, Your Honor. The judge's expression hardened. Did you knowingly ignore signs of coercion involving a vulnerable client? Richard looked toward me, then toward the floor. Yes. Susan gasped softly. Michael muttered a curse beneath his breath. But Richard continued speaking. I kept telling myself it was only family conflict. I should have stopped the process immediately. I failed Harold Anderson. His voice broke completely. And I failed Betty. For the first time since this nightmare began. I believed him. Not because his apology erased anything. It didn't. But because shame finally sounded genuine. Judge Whitmore recessed briefly before delivering her ruling. Those 15 minutes felt endless. I sat quietly beside Emily while my hands shook uncontrollably. Across the room, Michael whispered furiously to his attorney. Susan cried into tissues beside Daniel. Nobody looked like family anymore. Just survivors standing among ruins. Finally, the judge returned. Everyone stood. Judge Whitmore adjusted her glasses and began reading the decision. The court finds overwhelming evidence that the contested will presented after Harold Anderson's death was fraudulently executed and improperly notarized. Michael's shoulders dropped immediately. Susan closed her eyes. The court recognizes the attic will and accompanying documents as the lawful final testament of Harold Anderson. Tears spilled down my face instantly. Not because of money, not because of the house. Because my father's voice had finally been heard. The judge continued, "Further investigation regarding potential financial coercion, fraudulent filing, and ethical misconduct will be referred to appropriate authorities." Richard lowered his head. Michael looked completely destroyed. Then came the final line. "Betty Anderson is hereby recognized as primary beneficiary and executor of Harold Anderson's estate." It was over. Legally, anyway. But emotionally, nothing felt victorious. Michael suddenly stood as people began gathering documents. "You think you won?" he snapped bitterly. Emily immediately moved closer protectively, but I simply looked at my brother quietly. "No," I said softly. "I think Dad lost." That silenced him instantly, because deep down, he knew it was true. Dad lost peace, lost trust, lost the chance to spend his final months surrounded by genuine love instead of manipulation. And all for what money Michael would probably lose eventually anyway. Susan approached me cautiously near the courtroom exit. Her mascara was smeared. Her hands shook. "I never wanted it to go this far," she whispered. I stared at her for several seconds, then answered honestly, "Yes, you did." Her face crumpled. Because sometimes the cruelest thing isn't yelling, it's telling the truth gently. Outside the courthouse, snow fell softly across the city. Emily stood beside me while reporters lingered near the sidewalk hoping for statements. "You okay?" she asked quietly. I looked up at the gray winter sky. For the first time in months, I could breathe fully. Not healed, not happy, but lighter. "My father protected me," I whispered. Emily nodded. "Yes, he did." And standing there beneath falling snow, I finally understood something important. The real inheritance my father left me was never the house, never the money. It was the truth. Spring arrived slowly that year. Ohio. Winters always seem endless when you're grieving. Snow melts into cold rain. Bare trees remain empty for weeks, and everything feels suspended between endings and beginnings. 3 months after the court ruling, I stood alone on my father's front porch, holding a cup of coffee while morning sunlight stretched across the yard. For the first time in a very long time, the house felt peaceful again. Not happy, not yet, but peaceful. The legal aftermath continued quietly behind the scenes. Richard Coleman surrendered his law license before formal disciplinary proceedings concluded. Emily told me he'd likely never practice again. Oddly enough, I didn't feel satisfaction hearing that. Only sadness. One terrible decision can unravel an entire lifetime of respect. Michael's situation worsened quickly after the hearing. Without access to Dad's estate, his financial collapse became public. Creditors came after him aggressively. His business ventures failed one after another. Last I heard, he moved into a small apartment outside Columbus and rarely spoke to anyone from town anymore. Susan stayed with Daniel, though their marriage reportedly became strained after the trial. Gossip spread about constant arguments and financial problems. I tried not to follow any of it too closely, because eventually I realized something important. Pain can become addictive if you keep feeding it, and I didn't want bitterness to become the final chapter of my life. Still, for a while the silence hurt terribly. No family dinners, no holiday phone calls, no birthday cards. Years of pretending we were still connected had vanished overnight. One afternoon while cleaning Dad's workshop, I found myself crying over something ridiculous. A coffee stain. Dad had left a circular coffee stain on the workbench years earlier. I used to tease him about it constantly. Standing there staring at that faded ring in the wood, I suddenly realized I would never hear his laugh again. Grief works that way. It ambushes you inside ordinary moments. I sat down on the old workshop stool and cried harder than I had during the trial, not because of the betrayal anymore, because I missed my father. Just him, the man who carved wooden birds, the man who danced with Mom in the kitchen, the man who secretly hid a letter in the attic because he was trying to protect me even after he was gone. Eventually, I wiped my face and looked around the workshop carefully. Dust covered most of the tools. The unfinished rocking chair for Mom still sat in the corner exactly where he left it, half-sanded, incomplete, waiting. That night, I made a decision. I was going to finish it. The next few weeks became strangely healing. Every evening after work, I drove to the house, opened the workshop windows, and slowly taught myself the woodworking skills Dad once tried teaching me years ago. At first, I was terrible. I sanded unevenly, cut pieces crooked, dropped tools constantly. But little by little, the chair began taking shape. And somehow, while working with my hands in the same room where Dad spent most of his life, I stopped feeling so broken. Murphy usually slept near the workshop door while I worked. Sometimes I'd catch myself talking out loud to Dad without realizing it. "What do you think?" Too much stain. Mom would have hated this color. The strange thing was, the house no longer felt haunted by pain. It felt filled with memory. There's a difference. One afternoon in late April, Emily stopped by to bring final estate paperwork. She walked through the house slowly, smiling softly at the restored living room. "You've changed the place," she said. I looked around. Fresh curtains, new paint, sunlight finally reaching corners that stayed dark for years. "Maybe the house changed me too," I answered. Emily sat at the kitchen table while I signed documents transferring ownership fully into my name. When we finished, she hesitated before speaking again. "There's one more thing." She handed me a small envelope. "Richard asked me to give you this." My stomach tightened immediately. I opened it carefully. Inside was a handwritten note. "Betty, there are no words large enough to excuse what I allowed to happen. Your father trusted me for decades, and when it mattered most, I failed him. I hope someday you remember me for more than my worst mistake. Richard." I read the note twice before folding it quietly. "You don't have to answer him," Emily said gently. "I know." And honestly, I never did answer. Not because I hated him, but because some apologies arrived too late to repair what was broken. Still, I prayed he found peace somewhere. Eventually. In May, something unexpected happened. Susan came to the house. I almost didn't recognize her when I opened the front door. She looked thinner, tired, smaller somehow. Gone was the polished perfection she always hid behind. For several awkward seconds, neither of us spoke. Then she quietly asked, "Can I come in?" Part of me wanted to say no. Part of me remembered every lie, every manipulation, every cruel moment in court. But another part of me saw something else standing on that porch. Not a villain. A deeply flawed woman carrying shame she no longer knew how to hide. So I stepped aside. We sat together in the kitchen drinking coffee in painful silence. Finally, Susan began crying softly. "I don't even know when things got so bad," she whispered. I stared into my cup quietly. "I think we stopped being honest a long time ago." She nodded slowly. Then she admitted something I already suspected. Michael had convinced her dad intended to leave Betty everything unfairly. He promised they were only correcting the situation. At first she believed it. Then things spiraled too far. And you still went along with it, I said softly. Susan cried harder. I know. There was nothing else to say. Some wounds don't close with apologies. Still, before leaving, Susan stopped near the front door and looked back at me. Dad really loved you, Betty. My throat tightened instantly, because after everything, that was still the thing I needed most to hear. Summer arrived beautifully that year. The maple tree outside Dad's house bloomed greener than I remembered. Children rode bicycles down the street again. Neighbors waved from porches. Life continued, slowly, quietly, mercifully. One evening near sunset, I climbed into the attic one final time. Dust floated golden through the fading light. The old Christmas boxes remained stacked against the wall. And there near the corner sat the place where I found Dad's letter, the place where the truth finally found me. I opened the attic window slowly. Warm summer air drifted inside. For a long moment, I simply stood there breathing. No fear, no anger, no courtroom battles, just silence. Peaceful silence this time. Then I whispered the words I wish I'd said more often while Dad was alive. Thank you. Downstairs, Murphy barked softly. The house creaked gently around me, and for the first time since losing my father, I finally felt home again. Sometimes the deepest heartbreak doesn't come from losing someone we love. It comes from discovering who people truly are after the loss. Betty's story reminds us that family is not defined only by blood inheritance or shared names. Real family is built through presence, sacrifice, honesty, and love shown consistently over time. Harold Anderson understood something many people learn too late: avoiding conflict to keep peace can sometimes allow pain to grow in silence. But he also understood that truth has a way of surviving even when people try to bury it. In the end, Betty didn't win because she fought harder for money. She won because she protected her father's truth, his dignity, and the love they genuinely shared. There's also an important lesson here about kindness. Being kind does not mean accepting betrayal. Forgiveness does not mean allowing people to continue hurting you. Sometimes healing begins the moment we finally choose to stand up for ourselves without losing our humanity. If this story touched your heart, let me know in the comments. Have you ever experienced betrayal inside your own family? And what would you have done if you were in Betty's position? I'd also love to know where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoy emotional storytelling like this. Your support truly means more than you know.